break it down, the music will just ooze. One that you wanna listen to.
So in the United States, when we think of hip-hop, the first thing that typically comes to mind is rap music. And I think we often conflate or confuse rap music with hip-hop, the hip-hop subculture as a whole. And I'm wondering, how is le hip-hop in France different from our understanding of it in the United States?
Well, for one thing, when we say le hip-hop, we really mean dance. And dance has been the most visible, I guess, in France. You know, part of the iceberg, right, sticking up. But I would say also that French hip-hop dance hasn't relied on US rap music for its score. It's really had from the very beginning multiple musical threads going through it. And yes, I would say French hip-hop dancers are into the Anglo rap scene, you know, the global market for hip-hop and rap music, but they're not always dancing to it. And often for their choreography, they're choosing something else. And it can be Stravinsky, you know, in 2013, Farid Berki was doing breakdance, breaking right on Stravinsky and saying how good it was for that. So they've had their own rhythm, really. They've danced to their own rhythm.
In what ways does the French performance of hip-hop respond to culture, mainstream culture, differently than American hip-hop would? Or in other words, what is it that French dancers, choreographers are working against or challenging in their performances that an American public might not be aware of?
It's a great question. So one would say that maybe in France, hip-hop dancers aren't necessarily against anything, right? It's not necessarily counterculture. Of course, they identify with the American origins of the form, and so they're thinking about ways to contest power that aren't really French, right? But because the state saw early on the potential for this dance to become a professional form and to become a cultural form that goes on to the big national stages, they really diverted it in a way, I think, from really powerful contestatory modes. One could say, I mean, the argument that comes from this is that French hip-hop is recuperated, right? It's a history, a story of recuperation. And this is one critique that is leveled, especially by American or maybe Anglo historians of hip-hop around the world, that the French version got kind of sapped of its, you know, of that power to contest and to revolt. But in France, they'll have none of that. I mean, really, the dancers say things like, I'm not being recuperated by the state, for example. I'm recuperating my neighborhood or my posse or my people. They are creating value in their environment. They are taking it to the stage. They are taking the biggest stages in the country. And it's not about selling a lot of tickets, right? So they're actually really, I think, proud of that.
So how does le hip-hop in particular, and dance even more generally, complicate or kind of resituate our understanding of bodies and our relation to our bodily existence?
It's a huge question, bodily existence, right? So, right, because dance is embodied, okay, there have been a lot of critiques leveled at it. It's not really an art form. It's not really a work of art. It's not really work, right? So all over the world, staged dance, what we call, you know, concert dance on stage, has had to struggle against some prejudices, moral and other. But my interest in dance is that it's really not just about embodiment, but it's a figural language. So yes, you get on stage and you move, but you're saying something differently. You're saying something other, maybe, than what you can say in a discourse. In France, this has worked in hip-hop to allow people to talk about ethnic difference, even race, for example, which is really not something that is discussed openly until now in France. There isn't an official discourse for ethnic difference, for racial difference. In fact, it's illegal to gather statistics about such differences. So it's a very different setup from the English one, from the American one, where we think in order to respond to a history of segregation and prejudice, we want to have categories that people can identify with so they can lobby, actually, really, on behalf of their group for their rights. So completely different system. But also, again, I think dancing, because it goes beyond what the body can do. It's transforming on stage, right, and saying something otherwise. So I wouldn't stop with the body. I think these young dancers often are using bodily discourse to get past the kind of labeling that might actually trap them into lower socioeconomic strata.
So during your presentation yesterday, you mentioned that French dancers are performants in a way that American dancers are not.
I saw you nodding your head.
Yeah,
there.
and I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about that. What do you mean by that?
So French dancers really do some cultural work that is considered important in France. One of the reasons is that France, can claim, in fact, recently some authors have put out a volume claiming 300 years of supremacy, right? So they are joining into a kind of national admiration for dance, an intellectual valorization of dance, and a real, state cultural politics that has supported dance. Now, hip-hop is not ballet, I understand, but there's a way in which they are doing some work that really has a kind of return, if you like, for the people who are supporting it.
So there's a lot of criticisms here in the United States, or we hear a lot of criticism in the United States of the hip-hop subculture, of the genre of music, that it's heavily imbued with violence, and there's a lot of objectification of women. Do we hear those same things said about le hip-hop in France? And what do you say to those critics?
Well, again, we need to distinguish between the music and the global hip-hop scene in music, which I really don't talk about in my book, French Moves, and which I really don't know that much about. And many people have written very movingly about the way that system works. And they've also written, about the misogyny, the violence in the lyrics and that sort of thing. Again, because that sort of music really isn't the score for French hip-hop dance, you don't really see that. I will tell you an anecdote that when I was doing my field work and going around to lots of different hip-hop dance classes, I saw children's dance classes where the teacher would put on some hit music in English. And the lyrics would be pretty rough. And it was very clear to me that these children who were blissfully dancing to this, very cool American beat, and probably their parents, had no idea what was being said. So it's a little bit the way you'll hear recorded music in a Monoprix or a supermarket in France. They're playing Lou Reed, or they're playing, some things that are pretty radical, and people are happily shopping and consuming. They don't really get the words, I would say.
All right, and just one final question. In another presentation, you bring up the immortality of dancers, and you even dared the audience to tell you that Josephine Baker wasn't alive today. And I'm wondering if you could explain what you meant by that. Right.
So dancers don't die in some way, especially stars. This is probably true for all stars. Certainly the cinema, we know, supposedly brought this immortality to actors. I think in the dance cases that I had looked at, I was working on historical dance and dancers, and they never appeared to me as dead. I couldn't quite believe that they were, because we're still inspired by them. Their moves are with us. They're making us move. There's something about that remains very much alive. But to be honest, I didn't really understand it in that way until I started to work on these French hip-hoppers who are not only alive but quite young. And that changed everything. So when you really see that something that you're writing about someone's work matters to them, and you can give it to them, and they can show their mom, here's a researcher who understands what I'm doing, it really makes a difference. Then you realize that the historical dancers you've been working on, have actually died. But it was a bit of a shock for me.
Well, thank you so much for answering these questions, Felicia. It was a pleasure.
You're welcome.